Okay, Professor, this is my Prezi presentation on my my presentation here regarding my lesson plan for H.P. Lovecraft and the Language of Prejudice, subtitled Representations of Race in the Call of Cthulhu. So the basic concept here is that we are going to analyze language used to describe non-white peoples, um, and we're going to do that in early horror stories, namely that of H.P. Lovecraft. He's a little bit infamous for this, for racism. His work is highly regarded these days, even though it was poorly regarded in his day. But nowadays, its aesthetic value is highly regarded, but his depictions of race issues and just general bigotry is deeply problematic, as we like to say these days. So, the point of the lesson here, let me go to the next slide, is to analyze the language used and to compare it basically to compare it to what we our sensibilities today. And to do that, I am providing a great deal of historical context here. Notice that on the current slide, we've got the learning objective here, and the numbered points basically spell out the learning objective in sequential parts, so they build on each other. The students' responses must have arguments and observations that are based explicitly on textual evidence. So they need to demonstrate that they understand and can apply the text and kind of synthesize it to new ideas. They're particularly looking for the way that language can portray people and how it can, in this case, demonize or even animalize people by use of adjectives, descriptions, and basically how we can manipulate how we view other people via language. And the third, of course, is the application of a story written in the 1930s and how it compares and contrasts with the attitudes we would find today in specific ways. And of course, they have to use text evidence to demonstrate that. This is related to the Common Core standard here: cite strong and thorough textual evidence. Well, you can read the rest there. It's closely aligned to that particular standard. So here we go. So we have some personal details about H.P. Lovecraft. He's a really interesting guy, kind of odd. He was a bachelor. He had a very odd relationship with his mother. Kind of makes you think of Norman Bates a little bit. It was very suffocating. He had suffered from horrible insomnia and the nightmares, and his nightmares in many ways inspired his fiction. So this is just to give the kids a good background into who's writing this and what perspective he's coming from, basically. And you'll see in the corner there's a link to this is a kind of a accommodation, not accommodation, but it's just an aid for ELA students who might be struggling with Lovecraft's vocabulary, because Lovecraft can be very archaic. For instance, I use the title here: "Hideous Scripts from Eldritch Tomes." Eldritch is probably my favorite Lovecraft word. It means old, mysterious, powerful. Usually, you would use it to describe like a grimoire, a book of magic. He uses it to describe the Necronomicon in his work, which is very cool. And that's a picture of Lovecraft, of course. Next one: cosmic horror. This is basically the philosophical concept that Lovecraft uses in his fiction. It's a universe that's dominated by a pantheon of dark gods, or the Old Ones. The Old Ones are definitely non-anthropomorphic, so they're not like Zeus or Hades in Greek mythology. They're always depicted as monstrous. Well, not always, but usually depicted as monstrous, but extremely intelligent and deeply amoral, and um, completely uncaring to mankind. He was, even though his work contained supernatural entities that he refers to as gods, in many ways he was an atheist, and his work is deeply atheistic and materialist. And he saw himself, his worldview, as essentially scientific, and that man himself constructed meaning to his world. There was no inherent meaning, meaning, which of course meant that man makes meaning up. So this gives the students background into the perspective that Lovecraft's coming from. It's very important, and I have a link here to kind of differentiate instruction. That's a video that shows just how small and possibly insignificant mankind is when considering the actual scale of our universe. Okay. This is a background on a favorite subject of mine, Pulp Fiction, which were the kind of cheap, low-grade fiction magazines that H.P. Lovecraft's work was first published in. Uh, Pulp Fiction was lurid. It was prurient, considered almost pornographic, and his work was published there basically because no one else would have him. But nowadays, Pulp Fiction, its reputation has greatly increased among academics and critics because it really does have a fascinating aesthetic to it. And notice the extremely lurid cover art. That imagine this in the 1930s in the Depression, you would go to a newsstand and buy this, and you could see how it got its reputation with images like that were so salacious. This is just to give the kids give them a background and show how the literature was regarded in its original era and how we regard it today. Okay, here is a pretty infamous photo that shows the Jim Crow South, and this is another historical context here. Race relations, or just race, in the 20s and 30s, in particular during the Depression. The fact is that Lovecraft's work was published in a time in which racism was not only was open, and it was in many ways institutionalized, meaning that the state and academia supported racist ideas that are not only no longer believed but are just mostly unacceptable in most circles today. Scientific racism was a major theme at that time, which was what we regard now as pseudoscientific. Um, Basically, that the differences in human races are significant, particularly in intelligence, and that non-white or non-European races are basically incapable of maintaining true civilization. This was also, just as an illustration, was a time of enormous popularity for the Ku Klux Klan, and a lot of that was brought about by D.W. Griffith's film *The Birth of a Nation*. So, this is to give the context. Lovecraft wrote at a time where racism, open public racism, was very respectable, and it was acceptable. So it's not terribly surprising that his work would contain those attitudes. So here we go, our final slide. Where does where does Lovecraft stand on race? And more importantly, how do we evaluate his work given the content that we find unacceptable? So the students will take this context and they will use it to read the Call of Cthulhu and to see exactly how he describes other races and what that language does to our image of them. The passage from the text comes from a part in the story where the narrator encounters a voodoo cult, a voodoo being a religion, syncretist religion with African and American overtones, and the voodoo cult is trying to bring about the old ones like Cthulhu, bring them back to Earth. So it inherently demonizes them, and it kind of confuses a real religion, voodoo, with this destructive, anti-cosmic, almost satanic activity. So clearly, his views of other races are pejorative and paternalistic at best, but pejorative in many ways. So I want the students to understand why and how he reinforces those images via the use of language. And that is my dramatic ending, a question mark. So basically, they need to assess, given our disapproval of Lovecraft's ideas, does his work still have significant literary merit? And that is something they have to decide for themselves. All right. Thank you, Professor. I hope you enjoyed it.